What are Hungary's stated reasons for blocking the EU's €90 billion Ukraine loan? We know obviously it's about the oil, but how credible is this claim? And are they blackmailing the bloc by not restoring Russian oil flows via the pipeline?
My sense is that the bigger issue is that Hungary fundamentally observes that we are at a moment when the US has backed away from support for Ukraine. About 99% of direct US aid to Ukraine has ended over the past year under Trump. Clearly, that impedes the ability to impose significant additional sanctions on Russia. It's not just about the oil, it's also about the banking system. The the sanctions that were imposed early on in the war seemed impressive, but over time, many loopholes have emerged, and Russia's economy is surviving. The Hungarians observe that the EU wishes to step into that vacuum and make up the difference, basically, across the board, not just with oil sanctions, not just potentially with banking sanctions, but also with a supply of weapons to Ukraine and also intelligence, which is the main area where the Americans seem to be critical to the Ukrainian war effort. Uh, Orban in Hungary makes no pretense that he doesn't favor an end to the war more or less on Putin's terms. He, like Trump, has no particular preference for Ukraine as more of a democracy than Russia. Indeed, Ukraine is a flawed democracy. Russia is a complete dictatorship. This matters to the European Union. It doesn't matter to Hungary because the model Orban is trying to install in Hungary resembles more the Putin model of governance than does the democracies of the European Union. So Hungary basically is trying to block this entire thing. And with the European Union, oftentimes there are things that countries can do individually on a bilateral basis. But generally, it's more effective if done as a bloc. Most of the significant moves that the European Union can do vis-a-vis Russia, but in general, can be vetoed, therefore, by the bloc, because big decisions require a consensus, and each country of the 27 has a veto. And so Orban's misalignment with the EU over the basic proposition that they should do everything they can to allow Ukraine to survive this war intact and to force Russia to back down from its maximalist demands, and we can talk about what these are at this point, is a real problem. And Europe may well have to find ways to get around it, as I say, using country by country measures.
And given that most EU countries have significantly reduced or ended imports of Russian energy, what implication does Hungary's continued reliance on Russian oil have for European energy security and broader geopolitical strategy?
Hungary is an outlier in this regard, and Hungary is a fairly small country of 9 or 10 million people. So it doesn't change the big equation. I think Europe needs to decide whether it wants to wean itself completely off European oil and especially natural gas. And they've gone a long way towards that. Obviously, there is the issue of circuitous pipelines going through Azerbaijan and such. Ursula von der Leyen visited Baku some while ago, and to many in Europe, that seemed to be a shameful abdication of the goal, because much of the natural gas that would flow through that pipeline, in effect, comes from Russia. In some cases, hidden; in some cases, not even hidden. The bigger picture around the world is that if you really want rogue regimes like Russia and like Iran to face sanctions that are crippling and that can compel a change in behavior, then these need to be total. And the problem with total sanctions is that China almost systematically can be trusted to bail out those regimes. That is what has happened with Russia. That is, to a degree, what is happening with Iran. And for this to end, you'd need a larger meta deal between the United States and and China. And of course, there the problem is that this current administration in the U.S. really isn't particularly aligned with the idea of putting the maximal squeeze on Russia. They're playing games, and sometimes they pretend like they're offended by by Russian sanctions busting. As you know very well, there was a big issue with India buying so much Russian oil, vastly increased since the invasion in 2022. But that appears to be perhaps on the way to resolution. Uh, the problem with China in particular being sanctions busting a sister is major. But Europe, I think, is determined to do everything they can. And in the context of Europe, Hungary stands as a roadblock, less for its own consumption and more for its ability to veto grander European policy.
Mm. Thank you, Dan Perry, but please don't go too far as we will be coming back to you very shortly. France will summon the United States ambassador to Paris following comments made by American officials over the killing of a French far-right activist. In what ways has this fatal beating of the activist in Lyon, involving clashes between far-right and alleged hard left groups, deepened political divisions within France and influence international reactions?
It clearly reflects increasing not just divisions, but passions and anger in France. And obviously, the death of the Rank is a tragedy and a very bad sign. It factors in to the bigger cultural wars being promoted by the U.S. administration. They're going to clearly compare it to the assassination of Charlie Kirk in the fall. I don't think Rank had the same stature as Charlie Kirk among the far right, but the narrative sort of holds. And remember, Charlie Kirk was elevated to the status of like a major national figure, and they wanted to name national days after him, and basically to use his killing to inflame passions among the MAGA base, basically. So the United States finds itself currently in a cultural war of sorts with that part of the European establishment, which I think is dominant, that is fundamentally liberal, not in the American sense, but in the European sense, liberal democracies that respect minority rights and want separation of powers and don't want authoritarian government. Trump clearly is dragging America away from liberal democracy, and that is at the core of hostile appearances at the Munich Security Conference, be it by J.D. Vance last year, or to a lesser degree, but still the same message, by Marco Rubio last week, claiming that Europe is walking away from Western civilizational values like free speech because Europe attempts to limit the free speech of neo-Nazis, and Europe is, because of its fascistic past, is quite concerned with far right agitation. America's picking a fight with Europe in this regard, and because of this, the death we saw in France is sort of a convenient, tragic as it is, a convenient lever for them to use against France, claiming obviously that they're giving the far left, in this case the Insoumise party, too much leeway, and probably seeking to exaggerate the degree to which the far left in France is the source of the anger, because realistically it's the far right that's stirring the pot all across the continent, much more so than the far left, which is not to say that the far left in France in particular does not do a lot of damage to the cause of global liberalism in itself, which they most certainly do.